I was a 29-year-old waiter working at Martino's restaurant in Newark, New Jersey in October 1935, one of those upscale Italian places that catered to businessmen and politicians and the occasional criminal who wanted somewhere nice and discreet for meetings that couldn't happen in public. I'd been working there for 4 years, long enough to recognize most of our regular customers, long enough to know which tables were reserved for people who wanted privacy, long enough to understand that my job wasn't just serving food and drinks, but also keeping my mouth shut about who I saw and what I heard. On the evening of October 21st, 1935, I was assigned to work the private dining room in the back, a small space with one table that seated maybe 6 people, separated from the main restaurant by a heavy door that muffled sound. And my manager pulled me aside around 6 o'clock and said 2 very important gentlemen would be meeting there at 7:30. I should provide excellent service, ask no questions, and under no circumstances should I discuss anything I witnessed with anyone, ever. I nodded because I understood what that meant. These were men connected to organized crime, men who valued discretion above everything, men who could make problems for people who talked too much. Around 7:15, I set up the private room, fresh tablecloth, good silverware, 2 wine glasses, 2 water glasses, ashtray, because everyone smoked in 1935, and I made sure everything was perfect because my manager had made clear this meeting was important to people who mattered. At 7:38 exactly, 2 men arrived separately. The first one I recognized immediately as Dutch Schultz. I'd seen his photograph in newspapers. Everyone in New York and New Jersey knew who Dutch Schultz was, one of the most powerful and dangerous criminals in America. And he walked into that private room like he owned the building, didn't acknowledge me except to order whiskey neat, then sat down facing the door with his back to the wall the way criminals always sit when they're worried about being shot. 5 minutes later, the second man arrived, and I didn't recognize him at first. He was black, which was unusual for our restaurant, tall and well-dressed, moving with calm confidence. And when he walked into the private room, Dutch stood up, not friendly, but respectful, and they shook hands briefly before sitting down across from each other at that small table. I learned later his name was Bumpy Johnson, ran the numbers racket in Harlem, but at the time I just knew he was someone important enough to have a private meeting with Dutch Schultz on neutral ground. I brought their drinks, and Dutch told me to leave the whiskey bottle, said they didn't want to be disturbed unless they called for something. So I nodded and left the room, closing that heavy door behind me. But here's the thing about that door. It was solid wood and muffled most sound, but there was a gap at the bottom, maybe half an inch, and if you knelt down near that gap, you could hear conversations happening inside. Not every word, but enough to follow what was being discussed. I shouldn't have listened. It wasn't professional, and it definitely wasn't safe. But something made me curious about what these 2 men were discussing. What kind of business required this level of secrecy and formality? So after I delivered their drinks, I positioned myself near the door, pretending to organize menus on a nearby table, and I knelt down a few times to tie my shoe or pick up imaginary dropped items, and each time I was down there, I could hear fragments of their conversation through that gap. For the first 15 minutes or so, the conversation seemed calm. I heard Dutch's voice explaining something about operations and territories, heard the other man, Bumpy, responding in measured tones, both of them sounding like businessmen negotiating a contract. No raised voices, no obvious tension, just 2 professionals discussing business. Then something changed. I heard Dutch's voice get louder, heard him say something about stupid Negro and not understanding business, heard anger creeping into his tone, and I realized this negotiation wasn't going well. These men weren't reaching agreement. They were moving toward conflict. I heard Bumpy's voice respond, still calm, saying something about not needing Dutch's money or protection, saying the answer was no, same answer he'd given for 3 years, and I could hear Dutch's fury building even through that heavy door, could hear him practically spitting words about burning Harlem to the ground. Then silence, complete silence for maybe 5 or 10 seconds, and that silence was somehow more frightening than the arguing had been,
and I pressed my ear closer to that gap under the door, trying to hear what was happening, and I heard Dutch say, "Last chance, accept partnership or I kill you right now." And my blood went cold because I realized Dutch had pulled a gun, had escalated this business meeting into a potential murder, and I was kneeling there outside the door, wondering if I was about to hear a gunshot, wondering if I should run, get my manager, or call police, or just stay frozen in place. But no gunshot came. Instead, I heard Bumpy's voice, still calm, completely steady, saying something about death warrants and the commission and Luciano, explaining why Dutch couldn't kill him here without consequences. And I heard the absolute certainty in that voice. No fear, no pleading, just cold, logical explanation of why pulling that trigger would be suicide for Dutch, regardless of what it did to Bumpy. More silence, and then I heard movement, heard a chair scraping, heard Bumpy say, "Meeting's over, tell Luciano the negotiation failed." And I scrambled to my feet and moved away from that door as quickly as I could, positioned myself behind the bar where I'd look like I'd been working the whole time. Bumpy emerged first, walking with the same calm dignity he had arrived with, no sign of fear or stress on his face, despite have just had a gun pointed at him, and he nodded to me politely as he passed and walked out of the restaurant. Dutch came out maybe 30 seconds later. His face was red and twisted with rage, and he walked past me without looking at anyone, got into a car outside, and drove away. And I stood there behind that bar, feeling my hands shake, understanding I'd just witnessed something significant and dangerous.
My manager came over after both men had left and asked how the meeting went, and I told him it seemed tense, but both men left alive. And he nodded and said that was good, that was all that mattered, and he reminded me again that I shouldn't discuss what I'd seen or heard with anyone. And I assured him I understood, but privately I was processing what I'd witnessed, trying to make sense of why Dutch Schultz would pull a gun during a meeting that was supposed to be neutral ground, trying to understand what Bumpy Johnson had meant about the commission and Lucky Luciano. Over the next 2 days, I kept expecting something to happen, kept waiting for news that one of those men had killed the other, but everything seemed quiet. The restaurant operated normally, my regular shifts continued, and I started to think maybe the incident had blown over. Maybe both men had walked away and moved on with their business. Then, on the evening of October 23rd, 2 days after that meeting in our private dining room, I was working the dinner shift when one of the other waiters came running in from the street saying there'd been a shooting at the Palace Chop House, saying Dutch Schultz had been shot multiple times and was probably dying. And I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I knew immediately that what I'd witnessed 2 nights earlier was connected to what had just happened. The next day, newspapers confirmed it. Dutch Schultz had died from his wounds, shot in a restaurant bathroom by unknown assailants, and police were investigating but had no suspects. And I read those articles knowing something the police didn't know, knowing that 48 hours earlier, Dutch had pulled a gun on someone during a commission-sanctioned meeting, had violated rules that apparently mattered to powerful people, and now Dutch was dead. I never told anyone what I'd heard through that gap under the door, never went to police, never even told my manager or my fellow waiters, because I understood that talking about it would make me a problem for people who made problems disappear, and I valued my life more than I valued any moral obligation to provide information. But I thought about it constantly over the following weeks and months, thought about Bumpy Johnson's calm voice explaining why Dutch couldn't kill him, thought about how Dutch had lowered that gun and let Bumpy walk out alive, thought about how Dutch died exactly 48 hours later at the hands of people who probably wouldn't have acted if Dutch hadn't proven himself to be uncontrollable. About a month after Dutch's death, I was working an evening shift when Bumpy Johnson came into the restaurant, not for a meeting in the private room, but just for dinner in the main dining area, and I was assigned to his table, and I approached nervously with menus, wondering if he'd recognize me from that night, wondering if I should say anything about what I'd witnessed. He looked up at me when I approached, and I saw recognition in his eyes. He definitely remembered seeing me in that private room,
But he just smiled slightly and ordered his meal like nothing had ever happened, like we'd never shared space during one of the most important moments of his life. And I took his order and served his food, and he ate alone, reading a newspaper. And when he left, he tipped me $20, which was more than I made in a week, and I understood that tip was payment for my discretion, acknowledgement that I'd kept my mouth shut about what I'd heard. Over the following years, I continued working at Martino's, served hundreds of meals to hundreds of customers, including many more men connected to organized crime, and I learned to be invisible and deaf, to serve food and drinks without seeing or hearing anything that mattered, and that skill kept me employed and alive in a business where knowing too much could get you killed. In 1943, I left the restaurant business and got a job in a factory making parts for military equipment, and I spent the rest of my working life doing honest labor, far away from criminals and their dangerous meetings. But I never forgot that night in October 1935, never forgot kneeling by that door and hearing Dutch Schultz threaten to kill Bumpy Johnson. Never forgot the sound of Bumpy's calm voice explaining why that would be a fatal mistake. Years later, probably in the early 1960s, I was at a bar in Newark and got into a conversation with an older man who'd been involved in organized crime in the 30s and 40s, and somehow Dutch Schultz came up. And this man started telling stories about how crazy Dutch was, how unpredictable, how he'd eventually gotten himself killed by violating too many rules. And I asked carefully what he meant by that, and the man said that Dutch had pulled a gun on someone during a Commission-sanctioned meeting, had threatened to kill someone under Lucky Luciano's protection, and the Commission had voted to eliminate him for that and other violations. I didn't tell this man that I'd been there, that I'd heard it happen through a gap under a door, but I nodded and said that made sense, and the man continued, said that the person Dutch had threatened was Bumpy Johnson, said Bumpy had reported the incident to Luciano, and the Commission had used it as final justification to kill Dutch. And hearing that confirmed what I'd suspected for decades, that what I'd witnessed wasn't just a failed negotiation, but the moment that sealed Dutch Schultz's fate. In 1968, I read that Bumpy Johnson had died, heart attack at 62, and I felt strange about it, felt like I'd lost some connection to that October night 33 years earlier, felt like the last person who might remember me being in that room was now gone. And I went to my local library and read everything I could find about Bumpy's life and career. And I learned that after Dutch died, Bumpy had controlled Harlem for decades, had worked with the Italian Commission as an equal, had built an empire that lasted until his death. And I realized that the calm certainty I'd heard in his voice that night, explaining why Dutch couldn't kill him, wasn't bravado or bluffing. It was genuine understanding of how power worked, real knowledge that Dutch was already dead, he just didn't know it yet. I'm 93 years old now, living in a nursing home in New Jersey, one of the last people alive who was in that room on October 21st, 1935, who heard Dutch Schultz threaten Bumpy Johnson, who witnessed the moment that set in motion Dutch's execution 48 hours later. And sometimes I wonder if I should have told this story earlier, should have written it down or told it to a historian. But I kept my silence for 89 years, because that's what you did if you wanted to survive in that world. You saw things and heard things, and you kept your mouth shut about all of it.
What I learned that night, what I've carried with me for nearly 9 decades, is that real power isn't about who can make the loudest threats or pull the fastest gun. It's about understanding the systems and structures that govern behavior. It's about knowing which rules matter and which violations will be punished. And Dutch Schultz didn't understand that, thought his personal power and his willingness to use violence made him untouchable, thought he could pull a gun on someone during a commission meeting without consequences. But Bumpy Johnson understood it perfectly, understood that reporting Dutch's behavior to the right people would accomplish more than any retaliation he could personally deliver.
understood that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to let them defeat themselves through their own actions, while you document those actions for people who have the power and authority to act on that information. I heard it in his voice that night, through that gap under the door. Heard the absolute calm as he explained to Dutch why pulling that trigger would be suicide. Heard the certainty of someone who knew he was protected by forces larger than any individual criminal. Heard the patience of someone who understood that justice might not be immediate, but it would be thorough. And 48 hours later, Dutch Schultz was bleeding out in a bathroom, while Bumpy Johnson was safely back in Harlem. And that wasn't luck or coincidence, that was cause and effect. That was consequences for violating rules that mattered to people who enforced those rules absolutely. The private dining room at Martino's, where that meeting happened, was eventually renovated in the 1950s. The heavy door was replaced with a lighter, modern one. The gap at the bottom was sealed properly. And nobody working there now knows that the room was the site of one of the most important conversations in organized crime history. The moment when Dutch Schultz proved himself too unstable to live, and Bumpy Johnson proved himself too valuable to kill. I drive past the building sometimes. It's a different restaurant now. Italian place still, but with a different name and different owners. And I look at those windows and remember being 29 years old and terrified, kneeling by a door, listening to two criminals negotiate over territory and power, hearing a gun get pulled and somehow not hearing it get fired, witnessing the moment that set in motion events that would change organized crime in New York for decades. Sometimes my grandchildren ask me to tell them stories about the old days, about what life was like in the 30s and 40s, and I tell them sanitized versions, stories about hard work and making do with less. But I never tell them about that night, never explain that their grandfather once knelt by a door and heard a man sign his own death warrant by pulling a gun he didn't have the courage or stupidity to actually fire. That story dies with me, or at least the first-hand version does, because there are some things that shouldn't be passed down to younger generations, some knowledge that belongs to a time and place that no longer exists. Dutch Schultz died October 24, 1935, 48 hours and 7 minutes after pulling that gun on Bumpy Johnson, and I heard the beginning of that countdown through a gap under a door. Heard the moment when Dutch's fate was sealed by his own inability to control his temper and respect the authority of the commission that governed organized crime in New York. Bumpy Johnson lived another 33 years after that night, built an empire in Harlem, worked with the Italian families as an equal, became a legend in his own right, and every bit of that success traced back to his ability to stay calm when a gun was pointed at his face, his understanding that reporting violations to the proper authorities was more effective than responding with violence, his patience in letting the system deal with people who couldn't operate within the system's rules. I was just a waiter, invisible furniture in a room where important men discussed important things, but I heard what happened that night, heard the threat and the calm response, heard the moment when one man demonstrated why he deserved to die and another man demonstrated why he deserved to live. And for 89 years, I've kept that knowledge to myself, because that's what you did if you valued your life. You saw things and you stayed silent. Now I'm 93 years old, and Dutch Schultz has been dead for 89 years, and Bumpy Johnson has been dead for 56 years. And everyone who was in that room except me is gone. And I figure it's finally safe to tell this story, finally acceptable to admit I was there. I heard it. I witnessed the beginning of the end for one of America's most notorious criminals. If this story taught you something about the difference between making threats and understanding consequences, about how staying calm under pressure can be more powerful than responding with violence, about how working within systems can accomplish more than fighting against them, then remember it was told by someone who was actually there, who heard it happen, who kept silent for nearly a century, because that's what you did if you valued your life. You saw things, and you stayed silent. Now I'm 93 years old, and Dutch Schultz has been dead for 89 years, and Bumpy Johnson has been dead for 56 years, and everyone who was in that room except me is gone. And I figure it's finally safe to tell this story, finally acceptable to admit I was there. I heard it. I witnessed the beginning of the end for one of America's most notorious criminals. If this story taught you something about the difference between making threats and understanding consequences, about how staying calm under pressure can be more powerful than responding with violence, about how working within systems can accomplish more than fighting against them, then remember it was told by someone who was actually there, who heard it happen, who kept silent for nearly a century, because that's what you did if you valued your life. You saw things, and you stayed silent. Now I'm 93 years old, and Dutch Schultz has been dead for 89 years, and Bumpy Johnson has been dead for 56 years, and everyone who was in that room except me is gone. And I figure it's finally safe to tell this story, finally acceptable to admit I was there. I heard it. I witnessed the beginning of the end for one of America's most notorious criminals. If this story taught you something about the difference between making threats and understanding consequences, about how staying calm under pressure can be more powerful than responding with violence, about how working within systems can accomplish more than fighting against them, then remember it was told by someone who was actually there, who heard it happen, who kept silent for nearly a century, because that's what you did if you valued your life. You saw things, and you stayed silent.